When you begin to recognize that weakness is not a sign of defeat, but an open door for God's strength to be revealed, you start to see life through a different lens, because weakness humbles you. It strips away pride. It forces you to confront the reality that you cannot do it all on your own. And yet in that place of insufficiency, you discover the all-sufficiency of God. And this is where transformation begins, because the men of faith we look up to were never celebrated for being flawless. They were celebrated for trusting a flawless God. So when you study their lives, you see the same pattern. Weakness offered up, strength poured in, ordinary men becoming extraordinary vessels. And this is not just a history lesson. It is a living principle that applies to you today. Because in your career, in your family, in your inner battles, there are places where you feel unqualified or too broken, but it is in those very places that God delights to work, turning your insecurity into confidence, your fear into boldness, your doubt into unshakable faith. And though the world tells you to cover your weaknesses, to hide them or deny them, heaven tells you to surrender them, because in surrender they are redeemed, in surrender they are transformed, and you begin to walk in the paradox of strength that does not come from you, but through you, strength that flows out of weakness. And the more you rely on Him, the more you realize that what once limited you now positions you. What once felt like a burden now becomes a platform for impact. And as you keep walking this path of faith, you learn that your struggles are not wasted. Your scars are not meaningless, because they preach louder than your victories. They tell the story of how God takes broken vessels and makes them whole. And when you embrace this truth, you stop running from weakness and you start running toward God. You stop pretending to be strong and you start living in the freedom of His strength. And this is where your identity is renewed. This is where faith rises, and this is where weakness becomes not a liability, but a testimony that the God who worked through men of faith before is still working through you today. When you think about weakness, most of the time the natural response is to treat it as something shameful, something to be hidden, or something that disqualifies you from the life you want to live. But in the perspective of faith, weakness is never the end of the story. Because what feels like the lowest point in your life often becomes the very foundation for God to display His strength in you. And that is why when you look at the great men of faith through history, they were never perfect people. They were ordinary men who faced doubt, fear, failure, and insecurity, yet those flaws became the canvas for God's greatness. Because weakness has a way of making you depend on Him more fully. And dependence on God is the birthplace of transformation. So when you finally stop fighting to hide the areas where you fall short and instead surrender them, you open yourself to the reality that grace was never designed for the strong. It was designed for those who are aware of their need, because self-sufficiency can carry you only so far. But true sufficiency comes when you admit you are not enough and allow His presence to fill the gap. And this shift in thinking changes the way you see your struggles, because you begin to understand that weakness is not punishment. It is preparation. Weakness is not a wall. It is a doorway to strength. And when you walk through that doorway with faith, you start to witness the paradox of heaven, where the least becomes the greatest, the last becomes the first, and the broken become the chosen. And suddenly, what once seemed like a reason to quit becomes the reason to keep going. Because you realize you are not carrying this weight alone, but walking in step with a God who is committed to turning what you see as flaws into testimonies of victory. As this truth begins to sink deeper into your spirit, you start to see your daily battles in a new light. Because the very things you thought would disqualify you often become the reason others are drawn to your story. Since people connect more with your scars than with your trophies. They see themselves in your struggles, and when they watch you rise not by your own power, but by God's grace, they are inspired to believe that the same God can work in them too. And that is why weakness is not something to run from, but something to bring into the light. Because it is in the light that transformation happens. And as you walk forward, You discover that surrender is not about giving up, it is about giving over. It is about letting go of the illusion of control and trusting that God can do more with your weakness than you could ever do with your strength. And this becomes the rhythm of your life. A rhythm where you stop striving to prove yourself and start resting in who He has called you to be. And in that rest, your faith grows, your courage rises, your confidence deepens, and you become a living testimony that what once broke you now builds you, what once drained you now fuels you, and what once defined you in failure now defines you in faith. And this is the story of men who walk with God. Not men without weakness, but men whose weakness has been transformed into strength. Men who discover that when they are at their weakest point, they are actually in the strongest position. Because that is the very place where God's power can be revealed most clearly through them. Weakness is often treated as a barrier to success, a flaw that needs to be erased before you can be considered valuable or strong. But when you look at life through the eyes of faith, you see a completely different reality, because weakness is not the enemy of greatness. It is the place where greatness begins. It is the very soil in which God plants the seed of His strength. And if you pause for a moment to reflect on this truth, you realize that every limitation you carry, every insecurity you wrestle with, every failure that echoes in your memory is not meant to bury you, but to build you. For in those cracks of human imperfection, the light of God's grace shines brightest. And that light reveals that strength is not born from self-reliance, but from surrender. Because it is when you acknowledge that you cannot do it all on your own that you finally create space for God to step in. And this is why men of faith throughout history were never chosen because of their perfection, but because of their willingness to trust. Because trust turns weakness into a weapon. It transforms doubt into confidence. It changes fear into courage. And it allows the very things you once ran from to become the very things that shape your destiny. So when you embrace weakness as the place where transformation begins, you stop hiding and start healing. You stop pretending and start trusting. And that decision alone has the power to redirect the entire course of your life. As this understanding grows deeper in your heart, you begin to notice how God has always used weakness as a stage for His glory. Because the stories that inspire generations are not stories of flawless strength, but stories of broken men made whole, of fearful men made brave, of ordinary men made extraordinary through faith. And this pattern is not just reserved for the pages of history. It is alive in your own journey, because the struggles you face, the mistakes you regret, the battles you fight in secret, all have the potential to become platforms for God's power if you allow Him to work through them. And that is where the beauty of surrender unfolds. Because surrender does not mean you are giving up on the fight. It means you are giving over the fight to the one who cannot lose. It means you are trading your limited resources for His unlimited strength. And once you do this, something shifts inside you. Your perspective changes, your spirit is lifted, and you realize that what once held you back now sets you apart. Because people around you don't just see your success. They see your journey, they see your scars, and they see your faith. And that testimony becomes a living message that weakness is not the end of the road, but the beginning of a new path where God's power is revealed in ways you could never have imagined. This new perspective empowers you to live differently, because when you stop fearing weakness and start embracing it as part of your identity in God, you walk with a freedom that cannot be shaken. You no longer measure yourself against impossible standards. You no longer pretend to have it all together, and instead you walk in authenticity. And authenticity is powerful because it connects people to the truth. It reminds them that they too can rise, that they too can overcome. And it teaches them that strength is not about never falling, but about always rising. Not in your own power, but in God's power working through you. And when you live this way, weakness loses its grip, shame loses its voice, and fear loses its hold. Because you stand firmly in the reality that what once made you feel unworthy now makes you a vessel of grace. And what once looked like a stumbling block is now the very cornerstone of your testimony. And this is the paradox of faith, that the more you lean into God with your weaknesses, the stronger you actually become. Not because you found the strength within yourself, but because His strength has been alive in you all along, waiting for the moment you would let go of control and let Him turn your weakness into your strength. Weakness has a way of making you question your worth. It whispers that you are not enough, that you are too broken, too flawed, too limited to carry out the purpose that has been placed inside you. And yet when you look closely at the story of faith, you realize that weakness is not a curse, but a classroom. It is the place where the deepest lessons of trust, dependence, and transformation are learned, because strength by itself teaches you very little. But weakness forces you to lean on something greater than yourself. And that is why what feels like a limitation can actually become the greatest gift, because it drives you into the arms of God. And in that embrace, you find out that you were never meant to be sufficient on your own. You are meant to be a vessel for His sufficiency. And this realization begins to shift the way you see yourself, because you are no longer defined by what you cannot do, but by what God can do through you. And that changes everything. It changes everything. It changes how you face your failures, how you carry your struggles, how you respond to your doubts. Because suddenly weakness is no longer an excuse to quit, but an invitation to keep going, trusting that what you lack He supplies and what you cannot carry He sustains. The power of this truth becomes clearer when you see how it unfolds in the lives of men who dared to believe it. Because history is full of examples of ordinary people who carried extraordinary burdens, people who by natural standards should have been disqualified. Yet their stories were marked not by the absence of weakness, but by the presence of faith. And that same pattern repeats itself in your life, because your greatest battles are never fought with physical strength alone. They are fought in the realm of belief, in the willingness to let go of pride and embrace dependence, in the courage to say that you are not strong enough, but that God is. And when you choose that posture, you begin to live in a new rhythm, a rhythm where surrender becomes your strength, where faith replaces fear, where weakness no longer embarrasses you but empowers you, because it has become the evidence that you are not walking this journey alone. And in that evidence, your confidence grows, not because you are perfect, but because you are being perfected through every trial, every mistake, every season of weakness that is being reshaped into strength. As you continue walking in this understanding, your perspective on life begins to change in ways you never imagined, because you stop measuring your worth by worldly standards of success or ability, and you start measuring it by the grace that sustains you. And grace does not just cover weakness, it transforms it. It takes the raw material of your imperfections and turns it into a testimony that cannot be denied. And when others look at you, they don't just see what you have accomplished. They see what you have overcome. They see the quiet strength that comes from knowing you don't have to pretend anymore. You don't have to hide the parts of yourself that feel unworthy, because those very parts have been redeemed. And this authenticity draws people in, because they are not inspired by a polished facade. They are inspired by real stories of brokenness turned into beauty. And when they see you standing strong in the very place where you were once weak, they are reminded that they too can rise. They too can trust. They too can walk in the same grace that has carried you. This journey finally leads you to a new identity, one that is not defined by failure, not chained to insecurity, not crushed by fear, but renewed by the power of faith. And this identity gives you a boldness that does not come from arrogance, but from assurance. The assurance that even in your lowest moments, you are not disqualified. You are not discarded. You are not forgotten, because weakness does not exclude you from God's plan. It includes you in it. And when you begin to live with this renewed identity, every challenge becomes an opportunity. Every struggle becomes a lesson. Every weakness becomes a doorway to strength. And this transforms the way you approach life, because instead of asking why you are weak, you start asking how God will use it. Instead of resenting your struggles, you start embracing them as the soil of your growth. And this shift is the essence of faith, to believe that the very thing meant to break you is the thing God will use to build you. And when you live with that conviction, you discover the freedom of walking not in your own strength, but in His. And that is when your weakness truly becomes your strength. Weakness has a way of making you feel small. It convinces you that your flaws are permanent walls blocking your progress. But when you step into the perspective of faith, you learn that weakness is not a prison. It is a process. It is the refining fire through which strength is born. And when you stop trying to hide your imperfections and instead allow them to be used by God, you discover that what once held you back is the very thing that pushes you forward, because weakness forces you to depend on something greater than yourself. And in that dependence, you find power, clarity, and renewal. So instead of despising your weakness, you begin to see it as the classroom of transformation, where every lesson shapes you into the person you were designed to become. And in this classroom, the first lesson you learn is humility. Because it is only in humility that grace has room to work, only in humility that faith takes root, and only in humility that your weakness begins its journey toward becoming your strength. The lives of men who walked before us remind us that greatness was never built on flawless perfection, but on surrendered imperfection. Because their victories were not the result of unshakable strength, but the result of unshakable trust. And that same truth applies to you. Because the areas where you feel inadequate, unqualified, or unworthy are often the very areas where God wants to prove His faithfulness. And when you stop resisting and start surrendering, you see that weakness was never meant to disqualify you. It was meant to refine you. It was meant to strip away self-reliance and teach you the deeper strength that comes only from faith. And when faith rises in you, fear loses its grip, doubt loses its voice, and the lies of inadequacy lose their power. Because you realize that strength is not about having all the answers, but about trusting the one who does. And as you continue to surrender, you learn that your weakness is not an obstacle, but a stage on which God displays His glory. The transformation continues as you recognize that your struggles are not wasted, because every battle you fight, every scar you carry, every tear you shed becomes part of the story that not only shapes you, but also impacts others. And this is where weakness takes on a deeper purpose, because it connects you to people in ways strength never could. It allows others to see themselves in your story, to find hope in your perseverance, and to draw courage from your faith. And suddenly your weakness is no longer about you. It is about the lives you touch, the encouragement you bring, the testimony you share. And this is how weakness becomes a bridge. Because when people see that you are not perfect but still moving forward, they are reminded that they can too. And that shared humanity becomes a source of collective strength that multiplies far beyond your personal journey. And in this way, your weakness is redeemed not only for your growth, but for the growth of everyone around you. As you embrace this truth, you begin to live with a renewed identity, no longer chained to the false belief that you are defined by your failures, no longer weighed down by the shame of imperfection, but lifted by the assurance that weakness is the very soil where God plants His strength, growth. And with this assurance, you stop hiding and start shining. You stop doubting and start declaring. You stop running from who you are and start walking boldly in who you are becoming, because weakness is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of a new one. And when you live in this renewed identity, you carry a confidence that does not come from arrogance, but from faith. A confidence that reminds you that even when you feel weakest, you are still chosen, still called, still equipped, because the power working in you is greater than the weakness working against you. This identity brings freedom, because now you can face challenges without fear, setbacks without despair, and weaknesses without shame, knowing that every limitation is simply another opportunity for God's strength to be revealed. And this freedom changes the way you think, the way you live, and the way you lead, because you no longer measure success by the absence of weakness, but by the presence of faith. And that perspective becomes your greatest strength. It allows you to rise above discouragement, to endure seasons of difficulty, and to stand firm in the storms of life. Because you understand that weakness is not a dead end, but a doorway, not a curse, but a calling, not a liability, but a testimony. And when you walk through that doorway, answer that calling, and live that testimony, you become the living proof that God can take what was once broken, fragile, and flawed, and turn it into something strong, whole, and powerful. And that is the beauty of faith, that your weakness is never wasted, because it is always being transformed into your greatest strength. Weakness is something that every person encounters, no matter how strong or successful they may appear on the outside, because beneath the surface, every human heart carries insecurities, limitations, and struggles that often feel overwhelming. And when you see weakness only through the lens of the world, it seems like a flaw, a barrier, or even a reason to give up. But through the lens of faith, weakness takes on an entirely different meaning, because it is not an ending but a beginning, not a punishment but an opportunity, not a mark of shame but the very place where God begins his greatest work. And when you embrace this truth, you no longer spend your energy hiding your shortcomings. You begin to see them as invitations for transformation, because weakness is the soil where humility grows, and humility is the foundation for lasting strength. And the moment you admit you cannot do it all on your own is the very moment you create space for God to do what only he can do. Ultimately, this journey reveals the paradox of faith, that the very places where you feel the weakest are the very places where you stand to become the strongest. Not by your own might, but by the grace that works within you. And this truth reshapes the way you live, because you begin to welcome weakness as a doorway to strength. You begin to see failure as a stepping stone to growth. And you begin to trust that nothing is wasted, because every limitation, every hardship, every weakness is part of a larger story that ends not in defeat, but in transformation. And when you accept this, you walk with a confidence that cannot be shaken, because you know that weakness is no longer your enemy. It is your testimony. And the God who has turned weakness into strength in the lives of men of faith before is the same God who is turning your weakness into strength right now. And that assurance gives you courage to live boldly, to love deeply, and to trust fully, knowing that your weakness will always be the place where his strength is most clearly revealed.